Hello, I am Fraz Naqvi, and on the behalf of Institute of Regional Studies Islamabad, I welcome you all on this session of Eminent Speaker Series. The topic of today is Saudi-Iran standoff on the recent peace talks. It is to be remembered that last year Saudi Arabia and Iran held a secretive peace talks in the Iraqi capital of Baghdad, and it came as a surprise to many given the historical legacy of enmity and hostility between these two countries. Many analysts claim that it is because of two very factors. Number one, that Saudi Arabia has basically been very vulnerable in the Yemen war, and the Yemeni Houthis claim to be sponsored by Iran actually advanced towards the Saudi stronghold of Marib city. While the second reason was the ongoing Vienna talks on Iranian nuclear deal that was supposed to be done by now. However, in the last month, the peace talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran were abruptly halted because of certain reasons, and it came as a new chapter in the Middle Eastern history. So, to elaborate more on that and to understand the dynamics of this standoff, we have invited Dr. Hamid Reza Azizi, who is currently serving as the research fellow at German Institute of International and Security Affairs. Previously, Dr. Azizi also served as assistant professor at Shahid Beheshti University of Iran. So over to you, sir, to elaborate more on this topic.
Hello, thank you very much for your introduction, especially for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here to speak for the experts of the respected institutes of regional studies. First, I need to mention that just a couple of days ago, it became clear that Iran and Saudi Arabia are going to hold a new round of talks after a few months of pause in the negotiations. Probably as we are speaking today, the representatives of the two sides are once again in Iraq, in the Iraqi capital Baghdad, to talk to each other to resolve the outstanding issues. But on the other hand, there's a quick note about the topic, which is also related to the nature of our discussion today. I think maybe using the term peace talks is not, the best way of describing what's going on between the two countries, because, at the end of the day, despite the history of tensions, as our colleague just mentioned, but the two countries have never been at war. So maybe the term peace talks is not the best way of describing it. But on the other hand, as far as we know so far, there's not been any kind of concrete agenda yet for the discussions. It's been mostly a kind of the two sides exploring the situation for normalization of ties. So maybe using the term Iran-Saudi dialogue would be the best way of putting it, because on the one hand, as I said, there's not been a war. On the other side, the very agenda of the talks is not so clear. But in order to give maybe a kind of better picture, I start briefly with the background of the current tensions actually between Iran and Saudi Arabia, because as we know, the two countries have always been kind of rivals at the regional level for different reasons, geopolitical rivalry, especially after the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, the ideological rivalry, the competition for the so-called leadership of the Islamic world also added to the whole picture. So, but what we are facing now, what the two countries are trying to solve nowadays in these talks, It relates to what happened in January 2016, right? After the two sides basically, officially severed relationship. So we all remember that at the time. So it's already more than 7 years. At the time, it was somehow the Saudi initiative to cut the ties, which was in turn a reaction to a group of hardliners, Iranian hardliners, storming the Saudi embassy in Tehran and the Saudi consulate in Mashhad. Again, in turn, a reaction to the execution of a Saudi Shia cleric by the Saudi government. So there was this kind of, trend, this series of developments that resulted in the severance of diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But it would be a kind of oversimplification to name just this course of events as the main reason behind the severance of the relationship. On the other hand, reducing the reasons for the two sides, showing willingness to once again establish relations to the Yemen issue or the JCPOA, that would be also not, the whole picture. So for this reason, I think for explaining the reasons behind the severance of relations and then the willingness to establish the established relationship, we need to take into account a number of factors at three levels. At domestic level, meaning what was related to the domestic situation in both Iran and Saudi Arabia, and then the regional level in terms of the developments in the region that provided the ground for first, severance of the relationship, and then the desire to, revive the ties, and thirdly, the international level. So at the domestic level, I think we need to trace the developments back to January 2015, actually, when the former Saudi king, King Abdullah, Malik Abdullah, died, and King Salman came to power. Of course, Saudi domestic politics is not our discussion today, but as far as Saudi Arabia's foreign policy is concerned, this shift of power at the highest level in Saudi Arabia paved the way for a kind of more assertive, or in some, by some standards, we would say more aggressive, actually, foreign policy, especially because the new king's son, Mohammed bin Salman, since the very beginning, started to influence the decision-making, especially those decisions related to the foreign and defense policy. Of course, in 2015, and especially when the war started in Yemen, Mohammed bin Salman was still not the crown prince, but he was actually defense minister at the time. Many people believe that since the very beginning, actually, as I said, he had already started to decide the policies, foreign policy of the country. So basically, whatever the actual reason, or whoever actually behind the scene, this shift of power in Saudi Arabia caused the former conservative, or somehow conservative, Saudi foreign policy to be replaced by more assertive and defiant foreign policy. And within the framework of this new foreign policy, it seems that the new Saudi leadership's idea, or at least bin Salman's idea, was that disagreements and differences with Iran should be solved from the position of power. So less room for dialogue and diplomatic maneuvering, and more room for kind of, as I said, showing more defiance and trying to be at a position of power. At the same time, in Iran also, there were some very important developments that gave way to the developments of January 2016, the storming of the Saudi embassy. Because if you remember, in summer of 2015, Iran reached an agreement with the world powers on the nuclear issue, the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA. But the thing is that, as far as domestic competition and domestic political scene in Iran is concerned, the conservative and hardline camp in Iran were somehow unhappy with what had happened. It was and it still is a very complex situation when it comes to the nuclear issue, because on the one hand, of course, the deal itself and the removal of sanctions, basically, it was something that would benefit the whole, Iranian political system and, of course, the society. So there was no basic disagreement on that, but at the political level, because it was the moderate administration of Rouhani, of former President Hassan Rouhani, who had reached the deal, there was this concern among the conservative and hardline camp that this diplomatic victory for Rouhani would somehow establish his position and somehow change the balance of domestic power in favor of the reformist and moderate camp, and of course to the detriment of the hardliners. So that was one of the reasons, basically, is as I said, it would be an oversimplification to say that, it was just the people's, it was a kind of solely popular reaction to the execution of Saudi cleric in the days before that resulted in the attack to the Saudi embassy. But it was somehow, I would say, as much related to domestic power struggle in Iran as it was related to the Iran-Saudi competition in general. At the regional level, so that was about the domestic scene on both sides. At the regional level, after 2011, after the so-called Arab Spring developments, the differences, the tensions basically between the two sides started to rise, especially Iran's, help to save Bashar al-Assad government in Syria, Iran's support for the Shia opposition in Bahrain, and most importantly, of course, Iran's support for the Yemen's Houthis. These were the things that was as much as much those developments were seen as Iran supporting the Shias or supporting the so-called oppressed people of the region against the oppressors, against the oppressing governments, etc. It was, as much as that was the case that was the narrative on the Iranian side. The narrative on the Saudi side was that Iran has started an active policy of meddling or interfering in the Arab world's affairs. So that was, again, one of the reasons that increased the tensions between the sides, and actions and reactions. Iran support, on the other hand, the Saudi support for example, radical groups in Syria, in other places, that kind of, as I said, balancing and counterbalancing acts by both sides also added to the tensions and provided the ground basically for the severance of the diplomatic relations. And finally, at the international level, which is maybe even more decisive, or which was basically more decisive in finalizing maybe the decision, at least on the Saudi side, that this is the time to cut the relationship and go for another policy course, was the end of Democratic Party's role in the White House, the end of Barack Obama's presidency, and coming to power of Donald Trump. because all of us remember that Trump, even before getting elected, during the time of his electoral campaign, he had promised to pursue a strict policy against Iran, and including abandoning the JCPOA, as he did a couple of years later. So basically, it seems that the election of Donald Trump and this change of, these change of power in the United States gave a kind of confidence to the Saudis that Iran is going to be under huge pressure by the United States, as it did. And they were hoping that this pressure would weaken Iran in one way or another, be it kind of weakening of the central government's grip over or control over the Iranian territory, which would, give rise to centrifugal tendencies here and there in the country, or even a regime change, or whatever that could result in a weakened Iran, weakened Saudis. Rival would be desirable, of course, for the Saudis. So in that sense, I would say probably, again, not ignoring other factors, not ignoring the provocations on the Iranian side as well, on the sides of the Iranian hardliners, but probably the Saudis were actually waiting for a kind of opportunity to change course and to join the United States in the policy that was then became known as the maximum pressure policy. And if you remember, after the severance of ties in 2017, when the tensions between the sides were at its peak, Mohammed bin Salman said in an interview clearly that we want to bring the war into Iran. So by war, he probably meant the tensions in the Arab world and the basically proxy war or proxy competition, which was already ongoing between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But what I want to say is that it was kind of quite clear and quite obvious, and it wasn't even a matter of speculation. It was an announced policy, a kind of publicized, way of dealing with regional issues, especially in the case of Iran. So that was the picture back then in 2016. So my argument is that it was actually the combination of all these things, not just one of them, not just Iran's support for the Houthis, because, especially these days, we hear this again and again, as if the Yemen issue is the only problem between Iran and Saudis. And if Iran stops supporting the Houthis, or on the other side, if Saudi Arabia, for example, stops its kind of attempt to change the course of events in Yemen, everything would be fine between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Of course, that's not the case. The problem is higher than that. But why, after almost 7 years, or speaking of last year, almost 6 years, the two sides started talking to each other? Talks, as was mentioned, first it started with kind of secret negotiations between the top security officials of Iran and Saudi Arabia in Iraq, and then it became public, and so far we've had at least 4 rounds of negotiations, or dialogue, better to say, between the sides, and now there's going to be a 5th round. What I want to argue here is that, again, a combination of factors, not just one or two, resulted in the two sides showing willingness towards reestablishing ties, or at least toward talking to each other. And almost all of them was somehow related to the change in the factors that resulted in the cut of or the severance of diplomatic relations in the first place. So those factors changed. So changed the calculations of Iran and Saudi Arabia. Again, starting at the domestic level, I think the most important factor, the main factor impacting Iranian and Saudi calculations towards a bilateral relationship was the end of President Rouhani's term and the election of Ibrahim Raisi as the new Iranian president, because after years of struggle, it became finally, basically the conservative and hardline camp in Iran could somehow rest assured that at least for the coming years, they are going to be dominating almost the whole political system in the country. So with the we all remember how the whole scene was set for Raisi to win the election. Basically, no real reformist or moderate candidate was even allowed to enter the race, because the idea was basically to once and for all solve this problem, solve this domestic competition basically between the moderates and conservatives, and to somehow unify, as some would argue, the whole political system, the whole government. So anyway, after their success in bringing to power their favorable candidate, they started to, by day, the new administration, in coordination, this time in close coordination with other parts of the government, especially with the IRGC, with the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, and the others. They started with more comfort, basically, to pursue their own foreign policy priorities, which interestingly or ironically, I would say, are not much different than those pursued by Rouhani. So it's a matter of who is pursuing these policies, not necessarily which policies are pursued, basically, because taking these two examples to somehow clarify this point. In the case of the JCPOA, those very staunch critics of the JCPOA, those who were harshly criticizing the Rouhani administration for, for example, giving too much concessions to the West to get the JCPOA, etc. They started negotiations for reviving the JCPOA. So the same JCPOA, which was under attack just a few months ago, became a good thing suddenly. And the same happened with at the regional level. So those who were criticizing President Rouhani and Mr. Zarif for being soft on regional issues, for not being in coordination with the other parts of the government, and by other parts, especially the IRGC again, they started their own, outreach to the Arab world, to the region, and especially to Saudi Arabia. But this is also, this development, this change change of administration in Iran was also important for the Saudi side, because, there was this confusion, and to a great extent, kind of justifiable confusion, I would say, that who is in charge basically on the Iranian side. So this kind of dual government on the Iranian side, if we want to put it that way, or at least this ambiguity on the Iranian side, this competition on the Iranian side, IRGC, especially through the Quds Force, being active in the region, pursuing a certain set of policies. And on the other hand, the Rouhani administration and its foreign policy kind of advertising for another set of policies and another set of priorities. That was something that basically had dissuaded the Saudis from entering into talks. But now after making sure that there's going to be more cooperation, more coordination between different parts of the government, and the competition is gone, so they also felt more confident to enter into meaningful dialogue with the Iranian side. So this was again about the domestic level. At the regional level, after almost 6 years of war in Yemen at the time, it became quite clear for the Saudis that there's not going to be any military solution for Yemen, and not only for Saudis, of course, for everyone, that it is impossible for them, for the Saudis and for their allies to conquer Yemen, especially to conquer the whole of Yemen. And in the best case scenario, they would be able to, somehow have control over certain parts of the country, but defeating the Houthis basically through military means is impossible. At the same time, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, the situation drastically changed in this period. The whole regional scene, which was viewed by Iran as very threatening, Iran's regional rivals, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, for example, being active in Syria, in Iraq, also again in Syria, the ISIS or the so-called Islamic State posing threat against those countries and also against Iran. This whole thing, this whole scene had already changed, and in almost all these countries, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, Iran's allies or Iran's partners managed to survive, and not only survive, but also to establish and strengthen their position. So for this reason, for example, in the case of Syria, since 2018, it was already clear that, it is impossible to overthrow, to continue pursuing this policy of trying to militarily overthrow the Assad government. And for this reason, even some Arab countries like the UAE especially, which by the way, would be kind of unrealistic for us to think that it was done without at least informing the Saudis, if we are not going to speak of a green light by the Saudis or whatever. But anyway, countries like the UAE started the process of normalization with Syria, which at least as far as Iran is concerned, was viewed on the Iranian side, not as, and this is very important, this whole Arab countries' normalization with Syria, it has not viewed on the Iranian side as kind of negative development, but actually as those countries admitting Assad's victory and by extension, the victory of Iran and its allies. So the combination of these developments at the regional level, basically, it seems that those developments led the Saudis to rethink their priorities and to somehow understand that, no, it is not possible to push back Iran in the region by a kind of defined policy. So there's a need for dialogue. And finally, at the international level, what caused the Saudis to, and again, like the reasons for the severance of the relations, it seems that this international factor, again, played a very important role. And I'm not talking about the end of Donald Trump's presidency. I'm talking about when Donald Trump was still in power. In September 2019, when the Houthis attacked the Saudi oil facilities of Aramco, and the United States did nothing in supporting the Saudis. That was a huge, I would say, wake-up call for the Saudis to understand that they are no longer those close allies, or perceived as such close allies for the United States as they used to be, or they used to thought they are. So for this reason, this process of the Saudis recalculating their policies. Again, not only toward Yemen, but through the whole region, especially because Iran is the main competitor here. And if the Houthis, the Iran-backed Houthis, whatever we call them proxies, call them partners, call them allies, if they can do that kind of damage to the Saudis, and the Western allies would sit aside, what would happen if Iran wanted to use its own stockpile of missiles? So in that sense, it would make no sense for Saudi Arabia to continue that kind of confrontational path for Iran. And this process was just strengthened, of course, after Donald Trump left the White House, after Joe Biden, the current President Joe Biden, started speaking of a change in the US approach towards Saudi Arabia, making Saudi Arabia responsible for human rights violations, etc., etc. So this also added to the Saudi concerns that things are going to change at the regional level, things are going to change with regard to Saudi-US relations, and they need to act in order for their interests not to be compromised. And especially when maybe this was the last main development that triggered basically the negotiations, again, on both sides. And it was the resumption of talks after Biden came to power, the resumption of talks to revive the JCPOA, because the Saudis were concerned, as they were in 2015, that the JCPOA or the nuclear talks might result in a broader normalization, or at least the confliction between Iran and the United States, and that would put Riyadh in a very difficult situation. That was one part of the story. And on the other hand, there was an inclination on the Iranian side also. I mean, of course, Iran's official line is that we are not going to link the JCPOA talks to the regional issues. And of course, they are not, but they are doing this in their own, in their own way. I think Iran also showing willingness to enter into meaningful dialogue with Saudi Arabia right after restarting the JCPOA talks was somehow the Iranian way of reducing concerns with regard to the region. Because, at the end of the day, let me put it like this, at the end of the day, Iran says that the nuclear issue is something between us and the United States, or between us and the international community, the world powers, and it has nothing to do with the regional countries. So this is here. On the other side, there's the issue of our relations or even our problems with our neighbors in the region. And this is something between us and our neighbors, and it has nothing to do with the West. But at the same time, there is this understanding that without because both sides have had this experience of failed JCPOA in 2015 for a few reasons, including the lack of a kind of regional angle to this whole thing. So by starting negotiations with the Saudis, Iran wanted to give an assurance not only to Saudi Arabia and other neighbors, but also to the whole world that diplomacy is not limited to the nuclear issue, but we are the ones in charge of diplomacy. We are the ones who are, taking the initiative in that regard. So giving, basically, grasping this opportunity to do diplomacy in its own way. That was what somehow impacted Iran's calculation. And in that sense, we also need to consider the very important facts that is usually overlooked, that Iran as a country which claims to be the center of the Islamic world, Iran as a country which always, at least at the official level, I know that in practice, things differ in many places, but at least at the official level, they always promote this idea of Islamic unity and Islamic kind of cooperation, etc. It's quite a contradiction for Iran not to be in good terms with Saudi Arabia. That's the reason. If we look back, every single Iranian president, after coming to power, the first thing that they do is to try to improve ties with Saudi Arabia. That was the case with late President Hashemi Rafsanjani. That was the case with regard to Khatami, even with Ahmadinejad and with Rouhani, because in 2013, right after being elected, Rouhani also, took a regional tour and also reached out to Saudi Arabia. But of course, after the developments, it stopped. So this desire for having at least stable relations, if not very cooperative or whatever, with Saudi Arabia is always there. Competition is one thing, but enmity is something else. This is something which is usually misunderstood, especially in the West, because they put Saudi Arabia, when it comes to Iran and its regional activities and its regional policies, they put Saudi Arabia and Israel in the same basket, which is not the case. Because for Israel, it's a very complex situation. It's a kind of identity, geopolitical, security, all these kinds of things, ideological hostility between the two sides, especially looking at the picture from the Iranian side. But with Saudi Arabia, it's partly geopolitical, partly ideological, but as much as Iran needs to make sure of its geographical or geopolitical control over its periphery, it also needs good relationship with Saudi Arabia for the same ideological reasons. So I don't want to take much time, just very briefly, maybe in just 4 or 5 minutes. I will mention the reasons behind the pause, the halt in the talks recently, and a kind of look to the future. So based on the things that we already know, the Saudis, in this round of dialogue, and that's why in the beginning I said that there is still no clear agenda for the talks, at least as far as I know, because the Saudis wanted to start with Yemen and asking Iran to put pressure on the Houthis to push them towards basically compromise. But Iran's idea has been that the two sides need to first normalize relations, if not normalize relations, at least reestablish diplomatic ties, and then go into other issues. So this difference on the starting points was one of the reasons that somehow made the talks very slow, and then contributed to the whole pause in the Iran-Saudi dialogue. Then the complexities in the JCPOA talks, I think it had also had an impact in the current situation, because as I said, this international factor and this JCPOA factor was, and it still is, a very important consideration for the Saudi side and also for the Iranian side. So it seems that the Saudis have been waiting somehow for the result of the JCPOA to see that if it's really worth continuing this path of negotiations. If the JCPOA talks succeed, then we may see kind of more, somehow more willingness actually on the Saudi side for continuing this parallel track with Iran. And then there's also the continuation of the Houthi attacks against Saudi Arabia, against UAE. Of course, it was also driven by the continuation of the hostilities inside Yemen. But in any case, again, because for the Saudis, Yemen should be the starting point, it would be meaningless. It is meaningless from their viewpoint that we talk to Iran while the attacks against us by what they perceive as Iran's proxies, which is, to my understanding, not the case. Proxy in the standard definition of the word. We may go into that if there is a question. But then, in any case, to them it is meaningless to continue this path while the attacks are being still conducted against Saudi and Emirati facilities. And then a very important factor was the problems in the host country, which is Iraq, because as we know, Iraq went into an election, and then the post-election somehow chaos, political chaos. And the very fact that after a few months after the election, the new government has not is not still there. So for this reason, also, this also added to the complexities. And finally, on the same day that the sides were going to basically hold this fifth round of the negotiations, the day before, actually, two developments happened. Iran attacked Iraq's Erbil in the Kurdistan regional government, actually, by missiles, and Saudi Arabia executed 80 political prisoners, almost half of them Shias. So in that situation, of course, it was basically hard for both sides. For Saudi side, because their long-standing narrative that Iran meddles in the Arab affairs after such a big incident like Iran's missile strike to Iraq, to Erbil, to restart negotiation, and also for Iran to do that the day after the execution of 40 Shias. And here is the irony, because the execution of one Shia cleric resulted in the storm of the Saudi consulate and Saudi embassy. But this time, the execution of 40 just caused a pause in the negotiations. So everything is political, basically. If there is the political willingness, they would continue. Just they would stop for a while, but they would continue. So that's why I'm saying that Saudi cleric's execution and the aftermath was just an excuse for both sides, basically, to cut relationship. So this is it for now. And then there are some views, there are some proposals that this, for example, difficulty in terms of prioritizing issues can be solved in a kind of step-by-step manner. For example, Iran taking one step, Saudi side taking another step, and then, for example, reestablishing consulates, and then Iran reaching out to the Houthis to persuade them to, for example, change course, whatever. This is one of the factors that can contribute to somehow to re-energize the talks between the sides. The situation in Yemen is, of course, important. If the Yemeni talks really, take shape, because for now, even after Saudi Arabia pushed the Yemeni government in exile to somehow reshuffle, and the former president resigned, but it is still not recognized by the Houthis. So if Yemeni talks convene and continue, then it would be easier for both sides to just move on and start speaking about talking about other issues. And finally, the Ukraine crisis, I think, is already having impacts on especially Saudi calculations, because as we can see these days, the Saudi Arabia, and not only Saudi Arabia, but also other Arab countries of the region, they have started trying to maneuver between the West and Russia in order to somehow remind the West of their importance on many fronts, basically, and especially the energy markets, given the West's energy needs. And so it seems that there is a renewed hope on the Saudi side and the Arab countries side that they can regain their importance and their value that they used to have among the Western countries. And to what extent that's going to be the case, and to what extent the United States is going to actually support this, or the United States would compartmentalize issues, JCPOA from energy from Russia, Russia from Iran, then things would be different. Sorry for taking too much time. I just wanted to present a picture as comprehensive as possible, and I would be happy to hear your comments and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Azizi, for your valuable insight. It was indeed a thorough analysis on Saudi-Iranian relations. Initially, you talked about the ideological competition that eventually transformed into the geopolitical leadership competition. And then you talked about that it resulted in the policies of balancing and counterbalancing in various proxy states of the Middle East, including Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. And then you also talked about the three level of analysis in identifying and understanding the Saudi-Iranian talks, as well as previous relationships, which are domestic level of analysis, regional level of analysis, and international level of analysis. And finally, you also talked about that there is a need on the part of Iranian side to decipher the threat perception of Israel and Saudi Arabia onto different baskets, because the nature of hostility and competition are quite different for both cases. Taking the leverage of moderating this session, Dr. Azizi, I would like to ask a quite relevant question, that such sort of negotiations, dialogue is not new. Basically, we have seen such sort of dialogue during the tenure of President Hashmi Rafsanjani, during the tenure of Ahmadinejad. But all of these dialogues got influenced by the international factors. So how do you think that if the current Vienna talks on Iranian nuclear issue did not succeed, how would it impact the Saudi-Iranian talks at the regional level? Though officially they claim that international relations are not linked with the regional proceeding, but history is the evidence. So what are your views about that?
Thank you. That's a very valid and important question, of course. Here I think even at the official level, the Saudi and Iranian views and how this development, this potential development may impact their policies would differ. I mean, different impact on Iran, different impact on Saudi Arabia, because on the Iranian side, as I said, for that very important ideological reason, especially, and also in order to somehow convince the West that these are separate issues, Iran is somehow willing to continue this path of talks and somehow normalization with its Arab neighbors. But for Saudi Arabia, I think if JCPOA talks collapse, and at the same time, if this latest factor that I mentioned, this last factor that I mentioned, the Ukraine crisis, causes a kind of renewed strong partnership between Saudi Arabia and the United States, that might result in less desire, I think, on the Saudi side to continue this path of dialogue. But what is important here is for us to take into account the alternatives, because as we saw during Donald Trump's presidency and Iran's reaction to the maximum pressure, in these cases, Iran's reaction to the international pressure and the US pressure, basically, it's somehow, one way or another, involves regional countries and, US partners in the region as well. So the alternative, I think, would be increased tensions, and especially Iran, for example, increasing its support for the Houthis, doing its best not to let the Yemeni talks to reach a kind of conclusion. So that is where there might be a recalculation on the Saudi side. So if this looming crisis, or this potential crisis that might happen after, in the case of a total collapse of Iran-Saudi talks, if both sides take into account that matter, then they may continue dialogue regardless of the result of the JCPOA. In that case, I think the end result, the final outcome would be different, because if JCPOA is there and Iran-Saudi talks also, because there are different scenarios, right? So if the JCPOA talks succeed and the Saudi-Iran dialogue also succeed, then there might be some room even for actually meaningful cooperation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We've seen some unconfirmed reports that there have been signaling from the Saudis that they may even get involved in investment in Iran, in doing business in Iran. So that sort of things. But if the JCPOA talks collapse, and so that was the first scenario. If the JCPOA talks collapse, but Iran and Saudi Arabia continue their dialogue, I think the best case scenario would be a kind of just the confliction and a kind of modus vivendi between Iran and Saudi Arabia, short of cordial relationship or kind of somehow friendly relationship, some as I said, modus vivendi, some way of managing the relationship. And the third scenario, which is the worst scenario, as I mentioned, would be the collapse of both tracks, both the JCPOA and Iran-Saudi dialogue, which would be the result of which would be the increased tensions in the region and the new wave of, basically a new era of uncertainty, strategic uncertainty in the region, I think.
Yes, so you basically said that if the talk suspends on both sides, it would be consequential for the both sides. Linked to this feature of yours, this point of yours, how do you visualize the cruciality of these talks for Iran? Because although it has managed to influence the political sphere of Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, but all of these three states are basically struggling with their economy. There is an economic crisis in Lebanon and Iraq. There are mass protests going on regular basis, and Syria needs a massive investment for their for the development of their post-war infrastructure developments. So how do you see that if the Saudi-Iranian talk succeeds, the Saudi money will pour into these states, and it would basically uplift the socio-economic condition of these countries, and it would eventually be beneficial for Iran in sustaining its political influence over these countries?
The result of this potential scenario would be complex for Iran, because taking into consideration, for example, the example, taking into account the example of Syria, where the UAE especially has already started its outreach to the Assad government. On the one hand, of course, stability in those countries, as you mentioned, and also, of course, money investment means more stability while pro-Iran governments are in power. So that would be beneficial for Iran. Also, in the case of Syria, for example, this whole process of normalization, this Arab outreach to that country, would give the government of Syria more legitimacy. So that is also beneficial for Iran, right? Because Iran struggled for many years to reach this point. But on the other hand, because of Iran's own domestic economic problems, the Arabs dominating the economic sphere of Iraq, of Syria, and others would basically sideline Iran's role. And in the long term, it would roll back, basically, most, if not all, of Iran's achievements in those countries. Because we know that, with money comes influence, and by influence, in the long term, you can change the infrastructure of those countries. So it's a very complicated situation. On the one hand, Iran needs this to happen. On the other hand, it may somehow change the course of events. But for this reason, I think the Saudis getting involved economically in Iraq and Lebanon and other places, that's not at least an independent factor in Iran's calculation towards improving relations with the Saudis. Economic factor is important, but from another perspective, from the perspective of Iran, after a successful, for example, resumption of relationship with Saudi Arabia and decrease in tensions, in the sense of Iran, being in less need for spending money in those countries. So it's about Iran freeing its own resources because the tensions at the regional level has decreased, right? So Iran would need to spend less in the region. In that sense, it would help Iran, but not in the sense of the Saudis, as I said, investing in those countries. To put it very briefly, maybe as a kind of conclusion for this part, for this question, the problem with Iran's influence in the region is, of course, it is real and it is extensive, but it is not deep. By deep, I mean, it doesn't have the economic and cultural angles. In Iraq, for example, after 2003, Iran did have that kind of cultural influence as well. But look at the polls, and you see that how much the Iraqi people's view toward Iran's influence has somehow decreased, somehow deteriorated. So in that sense, Iran is already in a complicated situation. So the confliction at the regional level that would at least give Iran somehow free some resources for Iran in order to focus on other aspects of its influence. In that sense, you're right.
Another question, regarding another proxy battleground between Saudi Arabia and Iran is inevitably been Yemen. So how do you see that these recent negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia would basically transform the Yemeni dynamics, which would be beneficial for both these states? Because Yemen issue basically started in the wake of Arab uprisings, and it was entirely the you may say domestic issue. But over the period of time, it has transformed into a regional competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia, whether the Iranian influence is real, minimal, or maximal. But there are evidence that there is links, there are political and diplomatic links between Houthis and Iran. So is the case with Saudi Arabia and the internationally recognized Yemeni government. So how do you visualize that these recent negotiations or dialogue would eventually be beneficial for the Yemeni part? And linked to this question, do you see that there is a possibility of Yemen partition that would be beneficial, as in a way that the northern Yemen will be dominated by Houthis supported by Iran, while the southern Yemen will be dominated by the Saudi-backed government, as was the case previously before 1990, before the unification of Yemen?
Look, a very important point with regard to Yemen is that Yemen is not that much of strategic value for Iran, of course, as it is for Saudi Arabia, and it was never be such a thing. It was never such a thing for Iran. The very reason, or at least the main reason, that Iran got involved in the Yemen crisis in the first place was to put pressure on Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia was putting pressure on Iran in some important fronts like Iraq, like Lebanon, like Syria. So the idea, basically, to my understanding, the idea for the Iranian side was to get involved in Yemen, to put pressure on the Saudis right behind their back door, in order for Iran to be able to sooner or later do a bargain with the Saudis and somehow change the regional equation and reestablish the balance of power at the regional level. So that was the thing. But then, after 6-7 years of conflict in Yemen, the problem is that the Houthis gradually started to become a power, in their own. And that's right. There is a lot of ideological and economic, ideological ties between Iran and the Houthis, Iran supporting the Houthis with, especially financially, and also based on some reports via Hezbollah, by weapons, etc. But the thing is that through time, and with the continuation of this whole Yemen war, Iran's actual leverage on the Houthis decreased. That's one. Point number two is that not only in Yemen, but throughout the whole region, after the assassination of General Soleimani, Iran's central control over its non-state partners decreased. And now we see a kind of more decentralized management of this whole network of Iran's non-state allies. And within this framework, different parts of, in some cases, the Quds Force itself, but in some cases, especially in Yemen, it's been Lebanon's Hezbollah, which has been getting, a kind of upper hand in managing the affairs of that country. It was quite a while ago, I don't know if a couple of months ago, I saw reports that, when the Saudis first reached out to Iranians for Iran to do something in Yemen, they referred them to Hezbollah, to Hassan Nasrallah. So this decentralized nature also complicates the things. And this is a byproduct of the long-standing conflict in Yemen. So, of course, at the current situation, I would say Iran has less, especially if the things go as planned, and Iran and Saudi Arabia be successful in reestablishing ties, it would be really not so much desire on the Iranian side to continue that kind of extensive support for the Houthis. But would that mean that the Yemen issue would be solved overnight? I highly doubt that. And this is the reason that the Iranians are having a very hard time convincing the Saudis that they really don't have that much of leverage. If you look back at the Iranian officials' positions not so long back, it's like just a few months ago, started especially with this latest Houthi attack against UAE just a couple of months ago. The Iranian Foreign Ministry has, in a very unprecedented way, they are emphasizing on the need to end the Yemen war. Just a couple of days ago, Iran's Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, he mentioned in one of his speeches that, to the Saudis, and an address to the Saudis, that why are you continuing a war that you know that you are not going to win? So somehow pushing toward a diplomatic solution. That was seen by some as a threat, but I think it was a kind of, attempt to push the sides toward dialogue. So this is the complexity of the scene, and that's what would make the Yemen case somehow linger, even if Iran and Saudi Arabia reach an agreement today in Iraq.
Sir, just one last question. It was asked by my colleague, Mr. Imran Sardar, and it is quite relevant to Pakistan because the Saudi-Iranian competition has the consequential impact on Pakistani social dynamic in the form of sectarian clashes and sectarian killings. Do you think that if that rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran happens, then the sectarian divide within Pakistan would be minimized, number one. And number two, do you think that Saudi Arabia and Iran would consider Pakistan to assign the role of as a mediator between their mutual talks and to erase the differences and trust deficit, if there are any, between the two?
That's also a very good question. In terms of sectarian conflict, I think not only in Pakistan, throughout the whole region, including inside Iran and inside Saudi Arabia, because it has become a problem for the two countries themselves as well. Iran supporting the Shias in Saudi Arabia funneling money and giving other kinds of support to the extremists in Iran. So basically, kind of successful outcome of Iran-Saudi dialogue would be beneficial for somehow easing sectarian tensions throughout the whole region, of course, including Pakistan. So that's something I'm quite sure about. And with regard to Pakistan playing a mediating role, as far as, if I remember correctly, this idea was raised a couple of times, and basically, at least because I haven't, actually follow the reactions on the Saudi side so closely, but as long as Iran is concerned, Iran has been always positive toward this idea. But in practical terms, I don't think that they would abandon Iraq or another Arab country as the venue for the talks or as the mediator for a few different reasons. Because in this case, Iraq sits in a very special place. On the one hand, it has a considerable Shia population, and it has been a scene of Iran's influence for the past few years. On the other hand, it is perceived as part. So on the Iranian side, it is perceived as part of the Shia world. On the Saudi side, it is seen as part of the Arab world. And of course, there is this also Iraq's own desire to regain its traditional position as a regional power or whatever. So for this reason, I think, also because Iraq is a neighbor to both countries. So for the variety of reasons, I think they would continue with Iraq, and but I wouldn't rule out the role of Pakistan also as a facilitator, maybe not as a venue, but as a contributing actor if it's needed. Yeah, I think that would also be positive.
Dr. Azizi, it was really an insightful discussion on that, and your insightful and valuable analysis. We really got benefited from it, and hopefully for the future events, I'm definitely gonna invite you on the behalf of IRS. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here, as I said, and I hope we continue cooperation. It was great.
Thank you so much, sir. Take care.